The air was ablaze at 26,000 feet above the hostile expanse of the German Reich. Inside the cockpit of his North American P-51, First Lieutenant Jake "Razor" Riley felt the cold leach the heat from his gloved fingers, the metal of the control column like frozen iron against his palms. The sky was an unforgiving, pale blue canvas, the sun a distant, indifferent coin. Every inhale through his regulator tasted of frigid, metallic oxygen, and the thin skin of the canopy was decorated with dancing ice crystals, miniature snowflakes in a slow-motion ballet caused by the extreme temperature differential. Behind him, a dark, heavy shadow began to close. It was a Messerschmitt Bf-110, a twin-engine German fighter bomber, its bulk promising lethal firepower. The German pilot, sensing the Americans' peril at this crushing altitude, pushed his own aircraft, gaining speed, gaining advantage. Jake yanked the stick, pulling the Mustang into a steeper, hungrier climb, thinner, colder, and potentially deadlier air rushing past the nose. This was the altitude where most American pursuit planes choked. The thin air starved the combustion process. The relentless speed of a climb under combat power generated heat, faster than the standard cooling systems could possibly dissipate it. Engines would cough, coolant temperatures would spike, and pilots would have to throttle back, surrender the altitude advantage, or risk a catastrophic engine seizure. It was the accepted, bitter truth of high-altitude dogfighting. But Jake's aircraft, this specific P-51, behaved as if the rulebook had been tossed out the canopy. The powerful Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, the heart of the Mustang, didn't strain, it purred, a deep, resonant sound of contained power. It didn't stutter as he climbed past the 26,000-foot mark. It surged as if the cold, thin air was precisely what it had been waiting for. Jake didn't understand the technical reasons yet, but the feeling was undeniable. This machine was fundamentally different. It held its integrity where its brethren would falter. Below him, the German pilot, committed to the chase, attempted to follow the steep trajectory. The Messerschmitt, already struggling at the upper limits of its performance envelope, began to wobble. Its heavy Daimler-Benz engines sputtered a warning. The synchronization lost to altitude. Then, with a sudden, decisive lurch, the German fighter broke the climb, falling away, slipping into the depths of the blue void. Jake let out a ragged, half-gasping laugh of pure, frigid relief. His heart hammered a violent rhythm against his chest and his oxygen mask. His plane was an outlier. This was not according to the manual. The airframe was standard issue. The engine casing bore the same manufacturer markings. But somewhere something had been transformed. An unseen, unwritten edge had been granted to this machine. This critical advantage had not originated in the vast, sterile expanse of an aircraft factory, nor in the hushed halls of an engineering office. It had started hundreds of miles below, in the bone-aching chill of a makeshift hangar in East Anglia, England, where a single American enlisted mechanic had made a choice. A choice that flew in the face of standing orders, violated every maintenance regulation, and in that single cold moment had decisively saved Jake Riley's life. This is the true narrative of how one man's unsanctioned modification resurrected the most crucial fighter aircraft of the Second World War. A singular act of mechanical defiance that tipped the scales of air superiority over occupied Europe. The propagandized perfection. In the early months of 1943, American military brass was fervently selling a dream, a promise of unassailable technological superiority. The P-51 Mustang was its gleaming centerpiece. It was presented as more than just a new fighter. It was the ultimate convergence of sleek aerodynamic design, extraordinary range, and the raw power of the proven liquid-cooled British Merlin engine. It was lauded as the flawless counterpunch to the German Luftwaffe. Official communiques described it as an engineering masterpiece. Training documents were filled with accolades for its structural integrity and performance envelope. Public relations campaigns hailed it with powerful, resonant terms like revolutionary, unbeatable, and the long-range savior. The fighter was, supposedly, everything the American pilot needed to dominate the hostile, distant skies of Germany. Yet, on the cold, wind-scoured, muddy airfields of East Anglia, perfection was an increasingly difficult concept to uphold. The Mustang's performance was stellar on paper, exceptional in warm weather, and excellent during low-altitude test flights under controlled conditions. But the reality of combat was far more brutal. At 20,000 feet and higher, operating in sub-zero ambient temperatures, with the throttle pushed to its absolute maximum during a critical dogfight, the truth about the aircraft's hidden fatal weakness began to emerge. The cooling system, specifically, proved to be a liability. The characteristic belly-mounted air scoop beneath the fuselage was its signature feature, designed to ram high-pressure air through the main radiator. Engineers had theorized that this airflow could be so efficiently managed that it would not only cool the engine, but actually generate a small amount of forward thrust, a highly prized, theoretically possible phenomenon known as the Meredith effect. In practice, however, the system was temperamental and often deficient. Any minute disruption in the internal airflow, any small turbulence, sent engine temperatures skyrocketing. Pilot reports became a chorus of frustration. Engine overheating during sustained high-power climbs, temperature gauges spiking into the critical red zone during prolonged aerial engagements, forcing them to disengage and throttle back, and in the depths of the European winter, the engine coolant sometimes freezing solid in the lines before the Merlin could even reach its optimal operating temperature. Furthermore, the pressurized cooling loop was fragile. A single bullet or a failed gasket meant a rapid loss of coolant, leading to an engine seizure or often a sudden blinding fire. The problem was systemic and deadly. But the directive from high command remained inflexible and rigid. Do not modify the aircraft. Do not question the design. Follow the established procedure. This dictated obedience did not sit well with 35-year-old Staff Sergeant Melbourne, Tex Harper, a man whose roots lay in the oil-stained flatlands of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Tex was a lanky, quiet, intensely focused man with hands that possessed the tensile strength and precision of steel vices, and a mind that never ceased its mechanical interrogation of the world around him. Before the war had pulled him across the Atlantic, he had spent his youth stripping down and rebuilding flathead Ford engines, pushing their limits in unsanctioned drag races on dusty, forgotten back roads. He held little regard for rules made by men who had never turned a wrench, but he possessed an intimate, almost spiritual understanding of how machinery should work. Tex was assigned to the 357th Fighter Group, stationed at a former Royal Air Force satellite field near Cambridge. The location was merciless, relentless. Cold winds tore through the open hangars, and the concrete service pads froze every single night. He and his crew wrestled with the complex Mustangs for 12-hour shifts, often longer, striving to keep the aircraft serviceable amidst the perpetual mud, frost, and gale-force winds. Over the weeks, a profound dissatisfaction began to grow in him. It was a subtle, metallic groan he heard, a hollow sound the Merlin made during a full-throttle, high-altitude climb, a sound that resonated with a fundamental disharmony. Then came the relentless stream of pilot complaints, excessive engine temperatures, persistent failures in the cooling loop, and the most damning evidence of all, Mustangs returning scorched under the engine cowling, or far worse, not returning at all. Tex pored over every maintenance manual, cross-checked every specification, and compared the design against the harsh realities of the field. Then, late one bitter December night, after another battle-weary P-51 had limped back to the base, smelling of hot oil and scorched paint, Tex crouched beneath the fuselage with a hand-cranked flashlight. He stared intensely into the belly scoop. He began to ask the questions no one in the chain of command dared to voice. What if the angle of the scoop's inlet was all wrong? What if the internal airflow didn't compress and accelerate as the stateside designers believed it would? And what if, by reshaping only the inner contours of the cooling duct, he could force the radiator to work better, to run cooler, cleaner, and with a previously unimaginable efficiency? Officially, his duty was to log the recurring issue, write a formal complaint, and wait, perhaps for months, for an engineering bulletin to arrive from North American Aviation back in California. But Tex had recently lost two close friends in the air over Germany, both of whom had reported engine trouble moments before they vanished. He had no intention of waiting for paper to save lives. He made a quiet, definitive decision. The following morning, armed with nothing but salvaged scrap aluminum, a mobile welding unit, and the potent instinct sharpened by years of pushing high-performance engines to their breaking point, Staff Sergeant Tex Harper deliberately and consciously broke regulations. He sought no permission, filed no report, and informed no superior. He simply went to work. And in that singular, unauthorized act, he initiated a quiet, mechanical revolution. It began not with a general signature, but with a greasy, intuitive idea in a freezing English maintenance hangar. The unapproved hack Tex Harper's genius lay in his ability to translate mechanical feeling into tangible solutions. He didn't merely see a problem on a temperature chart. He felt the inefficiency in the strained engine sound, in the pattern of oil spray, and in the pilot's weary eyes. He knew deep in his gut that the standard system was failing the pilots who depended on it. His response wasn't a bureaucratic memo. It was a physical, aggressive attack on the problem, using the only tools he trusted: a hacksaw, a rivet gun, and his lifetime of machine sense. He began by removing the complex lower access panel beneath the belly scoop of a grounded P-51. Inside lay the core of the problem: the radiator duct, the air intake system designed to channel the intense high-speed airflow through the radiator matrix and then out the rear exit flap. The system was meant to be a pressurized tunnel, a thermodynamic marvel. On the surface, it appeared sound, but Tex believed the internal geometry was fundamentally flawed for the realities of high-speed, high-altitude combat. The theoretical goal of the duct was not just cooling. It was to accelerate the air passing through the duct so that the exit speed slightly exceeded the intake speed, thereby generating a measurable amount of forward thrust, the Meredith effect. This was an engineer's dream, a concept Rolls-Royce engineers had played with but never fully implemented into a production fighter. Tex hadn't read their theoretical papers. He didn't need to. He understood how fast air behaved through custom ducts from his experience with drag racers. What he saw inside the factory scoop was a structural abomination: jagged corners, misaligned internal joints, and a complete lack of the smooth guidance required to compress high-pressure air efficiently. The duct, in its current form, acted more like a subtle brake on the aircraft than a boost. Tex made his move. Utilizing thin, highly polished sheets of aluminum salvaged from a piece of a damaged wing panel, he carefully cut and shaped a series of internal vanes. These were not arbitrary pieces. They were precisely angled plates designed to gently but firmly narrow the airflow passage, forcing the incoming air to compress and streamline before it reached the dense core of the radiator. He smoothed every edge, meticulously riveted the vanes into place, and then, using a makeshift sealant of adhesive resin and spare parachute cloth, he created a perfect seal around the access hatch to eliminate any turbulence. The entire process was a work of intuitive, unsanctioned mechanical art. He breathed not a word of this to his commanding officer. The modification was not logged, and it was certainly not mentioned to the pilot scheduled to fly the aircraft the next morning, a 23-year-old second lieutenant named Jake Riley, the very same Razor we met earlier. Jake was a classic fighter pilot, daring, technically sharp, and just arrogant enough to push a machine beyond its posted limits. As he strapped into the cockpit, he was completely unaware that his life support system had just been radically re-engineered. 30 minutes into his high-altitude patrol, Jake radioed an unexpected report back to the base tower. "Base, this is Razor. Birds climbing smoother than a greased rail. Temps are rock solid. Did you slip a new engine in this bird? Over." Tex, listening from the maintenance shack, offered no reply. He simply allowed himself a minute, contained smile. The results, by the end of that inaugural flight, were impossible to ignore. High-altitude engine temperature at 26,000 feet was consistently down by a staggering 16 degrees Fahrenheit. The acceleration during the climb, the most critical phase of combat entry, was noticeably, powerfully improved. Jake reported that the plane felt wired tight, more responsive, more alive than any Mustang he had ever flown. He couldn't articulate the why, but he loved the what. Tex didn't stop with one plane. Over the following 2 weeks, working primarily under the cover of the night shift, he applied his revolutionary modification to 6 more Mustangs within the squadron. Each one received a custom-fitted duct system, subtly refined based on the performance feedback from the previous aircraft. He tweaked the angle of the compression vanes, reduced the drag profile further, and perfected the sealing methods. The cumulative impact was undeniable and dramatic. The aircraft that received the Tex mod climbed quicker, ran significantly cooler, and returned from the brutal, long-range escort missions with a fraction of the mechanical issues reported by the unmodified birds. Pilots soon began to request the hot ones, the aircraft assigned to Tex's maintenance crew. They unofficially nicknamed the improvements Harper's Hacks. The squadron commander, a pragmatic man who understood that results trumped paperwork, gave Tex the tacit, unofficial green light. Officially, the modifications did not exist. There was no paper trail, no authorization, only undeniable life-saving results. Other maintenance crews soon took notice. Quiet, guarded questions began to drift in from neighboring squadrons. "Hey, Tex, mind showing us exactly what you're doing with your scoops?" Mechanics started sneaking into Tex's hangar after midnight, armed with tape measures, flashlights, and the backs of cigarette packs, to sketch the design of the internal vanes. The modification spread through the fighter groups of the 8th Air Force like a vital wildfire. No one dared to formally report it. The men who flew these machines had a singular, ironclad code. Anything legal or otherwise that decisively helped bring a pilot home alive was an absolute secret worth keeping. Tex understood the precariousness of his situation. He wasn't just subtly altering military hardware, he was structurally modifying a vital aircraft during a war without any official approval. Discovery by a zealous officer could easily lead to a court-martial, demotion, or severe disciplinary action. But for him, the rulebook had become secondary to the fundamental imperative of survival. The pivotal moment arrived in the frigid middle of February. Captain Roy "Red" Lansing, the base's most respected and decorated ace, flew a deep escort mission into occupied France in one of Tex's early modified Mustangs. During the long patrol, Red was ambushed by a trio of formidable Focke-Wulf Tau W-190s. He fought them off for a grueling 12 minutes, using the enhanced climb rate to outclimb one, the stable power to outmaneuver another, and managing to limp home with his engine temperatures holding stable throughout the entire desperate engagement. After landing, Red taxied the battered P-51 straight to Tex's hangar. He cut the engine, climbed down, and walked directly up to the grease-stained sergeant. Looking him directly in the eye, Red said one simple sentence: "You saved my life up there, Tex. Whatever the hell you're doing, you keep doing it, son." Within days, the whispers reached the higher echelons of the command structure. It didn't come through formal reports, but through the vital intelligence of combat reports and detailed pilot debriefs. Senior officers suddenly began asking pointed questions. Why are your fighter group's aircraft lasting significantly longer? Why are your engines consistently running cooler than factory specifications? Why are your top pilots requesting the same 6 tail numbers for every dangerous mission? Tex knew his time was running out. It was a matter of days before an official, aggressive investigation would be ordered. But by that time, his little act of defiance had blossomed into a vital, life-saving reality. The Mustang evolves. What had started as a covert, unsanctioned adjustment to a single P-51 had rapidly gained an organic life of its own. Within a matter of weeks, Tex Harper's cooling modification was not just a widespread rumor. It was a full-fledged grassroots movement. Across the vast, damp airfields of the 8th Air Force, mechanics began replicating his work, improvising their own cooling duct adjustments, comparing the results of their airflow testing, and trading highly secretive stories over lukewarm, bitter coffee in the drafty maintenance sheds. The narrative was compelling, but the hard, quantifiable numbers made it undeniable. First, engine temperatures. Pilots flying the Tex-modified P-51s reported a consistent, verified drop in high-altitude engine temperature, ranging from 15 to 17 degrees Fahrenheit lower than the standard factory configurations. This margin, seemingly small on a dry engineering report, was the crucial difference between the pilot being able to push his aircraft to its lethal limits or being forced to throttle back to prevent a catastrophic engine fire at 25,000 feet. Second, time to climb. With the dramatically improved airflow and the reduced drag through the radiator duct, the Mustangs could reach their critical combat altitude faster, up to 12% faster, depending on the loadout and atmospheric conditions. This single factor allowed the pilots to get above their German adversaries more quickly, securing the air combat's most sacred advantage, the high-altitude energy advantage. Third, and perhaps the most important metric of all, was survivability. In one fighter squadron alone, the confirmed kill-to-loss ratio for the Tex-modified aircraft soared to more than 3-to-1 over a 6-week period. The pilots were the same, the firepower was identical, and the fuel was standard issue. The sole singular difference was the subtle, reshaped airflow duct and the determination of the mechanic who dared to cut it open. Soon, the word radiated far beyond Tex's original unit. Mechanics at satellite airfields across East Anglia began writing home, urgently requesting thin aluminum stock, specialty smoothing tools, and any form of powerful homemade sealants to reproduce the remarkable improvements. Some, in their desperation, even scavenged structural parts from grounded wrecked aircraft, simply to copy the complex geometry of the internal vanes. Unofficial, hand-drawn blueprints of the modification began to circulate on soiled napkins, tattered notepads, and even on pages torn from the official and highly forbidden aircraft maintenance logs. There was no central design authority. Each mechanic added his own subtle mechanical flair to the core concept. But every single improvement, every life saved, traced its origin back to Staff Sergeant Tex Harper and his original rule-breaking field experiment. Still, the top brass maintained a state of formal ignorance. Commanders at the wing and group level were acutely aware that something exceptional was occurring, but with kill ratios steadily improving and the mission success rates climbing to unheard-of levels, no one was remotely eager to launch a disruptive investigation. As long as the P-51s kept flying and the pilots kept coming home with triumphant tales of high-altitude dominance, any potential violation of regulations was quietly and conveniently overlooked. That calculated ignorance was shattered when a sharp-eyed, regulation-obsessed colonel from the 8th Air Force Command arrived for a routine, detailed maintenance inspection. While conducting a thorough walkthrough, he spotted the belly scoop on a P-51 that had been opened for a minor coolant check. Inside, he immediately noticed the non-standard ductwork, the gleaming, angled metal vanes. Polished to a near-perfect sheen, clearly and irrevocably not part of any authorized factory blueprint. His face flushed crimson. Within moments, he was barking demands for an explanation. Who authorized this fundamental structural modification? Where are the engineering documents? Why in the name of God hadn't North American Aviation, the manufacturer, been formally consulted? Tex was called in. He stood tall, coveralls stained, and did not equivocate. He explained, simply and with clinical clarity, precisely what he had modified and his rationale for doing so. He presented the operational data, the temperature logs, the climb rate comparisons, and the stack of enthusiastic combat reports. Other mechanics, suddenly emboldened, stepped forward to back him up. Then, the pilots arrived. Seasoned aces, men who risked their lives daily, lined up to speak directly to the colonel on Tech's behalf. Captain Red Lansing, the pilot whose life had been saved, stepped forward and delivered a single brutal sentence that silenced the hangar. "Sir, I do not care what is written in the tech manual. You can fly this bird cold, or you can die hot. That is the only choice we have up there." The colonel offered no immediate reply, but he made an urgent call that same evening. 2 days later, 2 senior engineers from North American Aviation, men wearing pressed wool coats and thick horn-rimmed glasses, arrived at the muddy, chaotic base. They carried blueprints, testing equipment, and a healthy dose of professional skepticism. They spent an exhaustive week meticulously examining Tech's modifications. They conducted detailed airflow tests, captured high-resolution photographs, and installed sophisticated pressure sensors inside one of the field-modified ducts. When the data was finally processed and returned, the verdict was clear, undeniable, and shocking to the engineers. Tex Harper's design didn't just work. It was an unrecognized stroke of genius. The internal vanes stabilized the turbulent air, dramatically reduced drag, and increased the crucial pressure differential across the radiator core. This maximized heat dissipation and allowed the mythical Meredith effect to reliably kick in under intense combat conditions, delivering the small but critical thrust gain that the original designers had only hoped for. In short, Tex, an enlisted mechanic, had achieved in a freezing, rudimentary hangar what a dedicated team of salaried engineers had failed to produce in 2 years of advanced laboratory development. The recommendation from North American was instantaneous and unequivocal. The company immediately began the process of formally reviewing the changes for incorporation into the very next, most famous production run of the P-51, the D variant, which would become the most lethal and widespread model of the entire war. As for Tex, he was not reprimanded. He was immediately promoted to technical sergeant and later received a formal field commendation for innovation under active combat conditions. But Tex was unmoved by the rank or the praise. What truly mattered to him were the pilots. The simple, profound fact that more of them were consistently returning home because of a simple physical change he had engineered with scrap metal and innate understanding, that was his only reward. And the pilots, they knew exactly who to thank. One of them, after a particularly grueling mission, carved a quiet message into the lower access panel of his Mustang with a dull pocket knife. For Tex, who made her breathe. When Brass found out, by the beginning of March 1944, Tex Harper's once secret duct modification was an open, whispered truth across the entire 8th Air Force. Dozens of P-51 Mustangs now carried the internal vane system. Pilots were climbing higher, fighting longer, and returning with a minimum of the dreaded overheating issues. But success of that magnitude is impossible to keep indefinitely from the higher bureaucratic structures. When the aforementioned colonel from 8th Air Force Command spotted the non-standard duct during his inspection, his subsequent reaction was entirely predictable, a fusion of swift fury and fear of liability. Military airframes were sacrosanct. They were not to be modified in the field, especially structural and life-critical components like the engine cooling system. The regulations existed for safety, for consistency, and for accountability. A stop work order was issued within hours. All aircraft with modified cooling ducts were to be immediately grounded for an extensive engineering review. No further changes, under any circumstances, were to be made without explicit written authorization. To Tex, this was more than a bureaucratic complication. It was a potential death warrant for his pilots. One aircraft, specifically Jake Riley's, had already been prepped for a long-range escort mission deep into the heart of Berlin, scheduled for the following morning. When Jake was informed his aircraft was suddenly grounded, he stormed into the maintenance tent. "You are telling me I have to fly a stock bird tomorrow," he demanded, his voice dangerously low. "Orders from upstairs, Lieutenant," a crew chief muttered, refusing to meet his eye. Jake turned to Tex. "Tell me this is a mistake, Sergeant." Tex's shoulders slumped, could only shake his head. He was powerless. That night, a palpable heavy tension settled over the frozen hangars. Mechanics whispered darkly about a potential court-martial for Tex and generalized punishment for the entire squadron. But then, something the command structure never anticipated happened. The pilots pushed back with the quiet, potent authority of men who confront death daily. It began with Captain Red Lansing. He walked directly into the squadron leader's office, still wearing his dusty flight jacket, and presented his case. He didn't shout. He simply laid out the truth. "Sir, I do not care what North American aviation wants. Those modified planes are what keep us alive at 30,000 feet. You put me in a stock model tomorrow, and I'm a sitting duck above 20,000 feet. That's a direct fact." More pilots followed in ones and twos. They offered quiet, firm testimonies. They were not engineers. They understood nothing of airflow ratios or pressure dynamics. But they understood results, and the results clearly stated that Tex's design worked, flawlessly. The squadron leader, now caught between his frustrated superiors and his most valuable combat assets, sent an urgent formal request to delay the grounding order until the aircraft could be properly, officially evaluated. The brass, reluctantly, conceded, but only on the condition that North American Aviation immediately dispatched their most senior engineers to inspect the modifications firsthand. And so they arrived. Two sober, serious men in formal attire, profoundly unsuited for the mud and noise of a frontline airfield. They meticulously examined Tex's modified Mustangs, taking precise measurements, asking pointed technical questions, and comparing the field modifications with the rigid factory specifications. At first, their silence was absolute, but once they ran their field wind tunnel simulations and pressure tests, utilizing their own portable instruments, the professional silence broke. "This is effective," one of them finally admitted, a tone of stunned reverence in his voice. "Very, very effective." They confirmed every claim Tex and the pilots had made for weeks. His subtly reshaped duct created a cleaner, smoother airflow, resulting in higher internal pressure and superior heat dissipation. It was no fluke. It was pure, intuitive, and sound engineering, even if it had not originated from a formal drafting table. The engineers did not stop at mere approval. They took exhaustive, detailed notes, which were immediately transmitted back to the main facilities in California. North American Aviation began the rapid process of adapting the core concept for all future production models. The confrontation had ended, not in disciplinary action, but in a vital, war-winning stride in progress. Tex was called into the squadron office once more. The very colonel who had threatened to ground the planes now handed him a formally typed letter. It was a commendation for field innovation. It was accompanied by a promotion and, more importantly, official recognition that his unauthorized modification had saved lives and improved combat efficiency. Tex, ever the man of few words, simply nodded, folded the document, tucked it into his breast pocket, and walked back to the hangar. There were still more planes to fix, more systems to check, and more pilots to protect. From rogue fix to official doctrine, by late March of 1944, what had originated as one man's quiet defiance had been fully legitimized. North American aviation engineers not only validated Tex Harper's intuitive design, they rapidly embraced it. Back in California, they began drafting formal, permanent revisions for the P-51's entire radiator duct system. The technical name for the improvement was officially recorded as the Internal Airflow Smoothing and Compression Retrofit. But among the pilots and the maintenance crews who had lived and fought with the change, it had only one resonant name, the Tex Fix. With the imminent release of the P-51D variant, the most celebrated and highly effective version of the Mustang, Tex's core ideas became a permanent structural feature. New Mustangs began rolling off the vast production lines featuring the newly optimized duct shapes, smoother internal flow paths, and the subtle, crucial design tweaks inspired by Tex's original scrap metal prototype. The engineers in suits had theorized for years. A mechanic in oil-stained coveralls had proven the concept decisively in the crucible of war. This was the central, unexpected twist of the entire affair. A mechanic with no formal engineering degree, no official title, and no authorization to innovate had not only solved a chronic high-altitude performance issue, but had also fundamentally reshaped the most effective fighter aircraft of the entire Second World War. The Mustang's renowned ability to escort heavy bombers deep into Germany without succumbing to overheating, its capability to climb higher and faster than nearly any other propeller-driven fighter, and its capacity to survive sustained, grueling dogfights above the clouds, all of it had been radically enhanced by a change that was never officially supposed to exist. The pilots felt the critical shift immediately. The new D-variant Mustangs felt tighter, far cleaner in the climb, and dramatically more responsive during high-altitude maneuvers. Engine temperatures remained stable even under extended emergency power. In combat, this translated directly into fewer aborted missions, fewer catastrophic engine failures, and an infinitely greater margin for survival. By the time the massive preparations for the Normandy invasion were underway in June of 1944, Mustang squadrons across England were flying almost exclusively with aircraft that incorporated the revised Tex-inspired cooling design. The fix that had once been grounded was now considered gospel. Tex never boasted about the achievement. He avoided interviews, never wrote reports, and his name was never formally added to the official blueprints. But among the crews, he became a silent, living legend. Not because he sought fame, but because he possessed the integrity to do what was right. There is a moving story told by one of the youngest mechanics who served under Tex during those vital months. He recalled that after the first P-51D arrived on base with the new optimized duct already factory installed, Tex walked around the aircraft once, crouched down, ran his calloused hand along the new inner curve of the scoop, and gave a single satisfied nod. Then, he spoke only two words. They got it. For Tex, that was the ultimate, sufficient credit. It was not about personal recognition. It was about seeing that his idea, born of sheer necessity, mechanical instinct, and a little rule-breaking, had finally found its rightful permanent place in the war effort. For the pilots, the message was even simpler and more direct. They didn't care about the origin of the fix. They simply knew their Mustangs ran cooler, flew better, and most importantly, brought them home more often than before. This incredible transition from a rogue field-expedient fix to official military doctrine was a profoundly rare moment in the history of military technology. It stands as a powerful reminder that the true front lines of innovation are not always located in corporate boardrooms or gleaming research laboratories, but often in frozen, drafty hangars, working underneath leaking engines, in the hands of quiet men who possess the wisdom to trust what they feel more than what they are formally told. The battle over Berlin. March 6, 1944. The U.S. 8th Air Force launched its most audacious, most brutal daylight bombing mission of the entire war, the assault on Berlin. It was the symbolic and industrial heart of the Third Reich, the center of Nazi power, manufacturing, and propaganda. The German High Command had fully anticipated this attack and had positioned everything they possessed in the sky to stop it. Hundreds of American heavy bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, lifted off from bases across the Allied territories. Their mission was to strike the heavily fortified industrial and military facilities, ringing the German capital. Their protection was provided by vast, high-flying squadrons of P-51 Mustangs, tasked with flying faster and farther than any escort fighter before. For weeks leading up to this ultimate test, Tex Harper's modified Mustangs, and now their factory-born successors, had demonstrated their overwhelming worth. But no proving ground was more unforgiving than the airspace directly above Berlin. It was, without question, the most heavily defended air corridor in all of Europe. The Luftwaffe had amassed its finest squadrons along the route, highly experienced, aggressive pilots flying the fearsome Focke-Wulf 190s and the agile Messerschmitt Bf 109s. The initial hours of the mission were marked by a profound, chilling silence. The bombers pressed eastward in their tight, disciplined formation, their massive silhouettes defined against a cold, pale sky. But just west of the German capital, the trap was sprung. German radar picked up the vast American force, and enemy fighters scrambled in waves. The German strategy was simple and sound. Hit the bombers violently and quickly before they could reach the city, and execute the attack above 25,000 feet, where the crushing cold and thin air would naturally challenge the American engines and test the pilots' nerves to the breaking point. But this time, the Mustangs did not struggle. They did not lag, did not overheat, and they did not break formation. They stayed high, they stayed fast, and they struck back with terrifying unified force. In the ensuing chaos, dozens of intense, twisting dogfights erupted across the sky, stretching for miles. Mustang pilots, utilizing the new reliable power, dove and climbed with a precision previously impossible, executing razor-sharp turns and slashing attacks that carved deep into the German formations. They no longer had the fatalistic worry about managing engine temperatures during the climax of combat. They could now remain in the fight for critical, extended periods. With that newfound reliability came a profound, decisive aggressiveness. Captain Red Lansing, flying one of Tex's earliest field-modified Mustangs, was later credited with scoring 3 confirmed kills that day, a Messerschmitt and 2 Focke-Wulfs taken down in a desperate 10-minute stretch near Potsdam. In his debriefing, he spoke with almost religious awe. The engine didn't even flinch. I was climbing at 30,000 feet and still had full power left. They tried to outclimb me, and they simply couldn't. It was all over for them. Other pilots reported the exact same experience. One group specifically credited the cooling system improvements for enabling extended, high-power climbs that would have been suicidal just months before. No overheating, no coolant boil-off, just raw, utterly reliable power. By the mission's final tally, 69 German aircraft had been confirmed destroyed, and many more were damaged beyond repair. The Luftwaffe had been dealt a crippling single-day blow from which its high-altitude fighter arm would never fully recover. Most stunning of all, a massive percentage of the American bomber force successfully reached its targets and returned home. The Berlin raid was not merely a military strike, it was a profound, definitive statement. It proved that the U.S. had achieved verifiable, lasting air superiority, even over the most heavily defended city in the entire European theater. And while the headlines back in the United States praised the unquestionable courage of the bomber crews and the aggressive precision of the fighter pilots, almost no one knew the small, unseen factor that had made that world-changing mission possible. It was not just the power of the Merlin engine, or the capacity of the extra fuel tanks, or the grueling combat training. It was, at its very core, airflow. It was cooling. It was the simple life-or-death ability to fight at 30,000 feet without your own machine turning traitor against you. And for that silent, invisible edge, the ultimate credit went to the man who never left the ground, a man who worked in the bone-chilling cold, with his hands perpetually covered in grease, holding no rank that mattered to the war machine. Technical Sergeant Tex Harper. That single day above Berlin marked a turning point, not only in the grand strategic trajectory of the war, but in the very fundamental philosophy of air combat. It was no longer enough to possess speed or sheer firepower. You required absolute, unwavering reliability. You needed altitude as a weapon. You needed the unseen, subtle edge, and thanks to the quiet defiance of a lone mechanic, the P-51 Mustang possessed it. What Tex left behind. Following the momentous success of the Berlin raid, the nature of the air war over Europe irrevocably changed. The Mustang, already highly respected, instantly became feared. German pilots quickly learned to recognize its distinctive sleek silhouette and to dread its long-range presence. The P-51 was transformed from merely a fast escort to a relentless, high-altitude predator, an aircraft that could fly farther, climb faster, and fight longer than any propeller-driven machine the Luftwaffe could field. The secret to this monumental leap in performance was not a high-level strategic meeting or a factory breakthrough. It was a single mechanic armed with a hacksaw in a cold, lonely hangar, a man who refused to accept that good enough was the only option. Tex Harper, true to his nature, never appeared in the major headlines. He never granted interviews, never sought an ounce of public credit, and faded back into the quiet obscurity he preferred. After the cessation of hostilities in 1945, he returned to his home in Oklahoma and opened a small, unassuming engine repair shop. Most of his customers, bringing in their broken tractor engines and their sputtering family cars, never knew that he had once literally shaped the skies over a continent at war. But his profound, lasting legacy did not end in 1945. The core principles behind his cooling modification, the practical, field-proven application of the theoretical Meredith effect, became fundamental to post-war aircraft design. Engineers studying the emerging field of jet propulsion borrowed lessons directly from Tex's battlefield ductwork. The revolutionary idea that a cooling system could be designed to actively contribute a small amount of thrust, rather than merely manage destructive heat, carried forward directly into the dawning jet age. Even in the Korean War, American jets like the swift F-86 Sabre directly benefited from refined airflow engineering that traced its technological roots back to what Tex had conclusively proven under the fuselage of a P-51 Mustang in 1944. Modern stealth fighters, with their meticulously managed heat signatures and highly complex internal ducting, owe an undeniable technical debt to the simple elegance of what happened that winter in England. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of all is not found in complex blueprints or formal museum plaques. At the sprawling National Museum of the United States Air Force in Dayton, Ohio, stands a beautifully restored P-51 Mustang, painted in the authentic colors of the legendary 8th Air Force. Its aluminum skin gleams and the traditional invasion stripes ring its wings. The name Lucky Lady is stenciled proudly beneath the cockpit. And if a visitor is willing to crouch low all the way down and look deeply into the underside of the belly, just inside the leading edge of the massive radiator scoop, they will be able to see something that most museum visitors entirely miss. 3 simple, carefully etched words. For Tex, who made her breathe. There was no formal ceremony, no statue erected, just a quiet, profound acknowledgement from one generation of warriors to the quiet man who fundamentally helped them survive. That is the kind of legacy that outlives all medals and all citations. They often say that history is written by the victors, but sometimes the most profoundly important life-saving parts are written in grease, not ink, recorded in silence, not in triumphant speeches. Tex Harper never personally fired a machine gun in combat. He never pulled bone-crushing G's in a desperate, twisting dogfight, or bailed out of a burning cockpit over enemy territory. But without his single-minded focus and his sheer mechanical courage, a whole generation of bomber crews and fighter pilots might never have returned to their homes. He broke the rules. He completely ignored a rigid procedure. And in doing so, he saved innumerable lives. Not through overwhelming force, but through pure, decisive focus. Not through rigid orders, but through a profound, intuitive understanding of machinery. He saw a deadly problem, and instead of waiting for a paper solution that might never arrive, he fixed it. That is not just engineering genius. It is a profound, life-affirming courage. Lieutenant Jake Riley, the pilot we met at the beginning of this sprawling narrative, once gave a brief recorded interview years after the war had ended. He was an older man by then, his hair white, his voice measured and quiet. But when he was asked the inevitable question, who was his true hero from the war, he did not name a famous general, nor a storied colonel, nor even another ace pilot. He simply stated this: people talk about the aces, and they should. But the man who absolutely saved my life wore oil-stained coveralls and never ever left the ground. I don't even know if I ever saw his face clearly, but I remember how that engine held together when I needed it most, when the cold was trying to tear the wings off the plane. He gave me altitude, and that altitude gave me a fighting chance to come home. There are thousands of profound stories like that from the Great War, stories that were nearly lost to history or never fully told. Stories that serve as a constant, humbling reminder that victory is not exclusively about overwhelming firepower or spectacular bravery in the sky. It is also, crucially, about people like Tex, the ones who work quietly, diligently, solving the small, deadly problems. The ones who build things better, not because they are ordered to, but because they know, intrinsically, that it is the right thing to do. Not all heroes fly the aircraft. Some of the most important heroes kneel patiently under a Mustang in the dead of night, shaping cold aluminum with freezing hands, thinking only of the pilot who will sit behind that engine tomorrow. And thanks to the profound, unauthorized genius of Technical Sergeant Tex Harper, that pilot had an infinitely better chance of coming home alive.